had a conversation at Search, like an all staff meeting with our headquarters staff in DC, again, done virtually. And it was through those conversations that I actually started to realize, I mean, I saw how angry and frustrated everyone was, right? That was just probably the biggest immediate reaction. But also a lot of people started talking about stories of hope, right? So specific instances with their family, with their friends, that indicated that actually people were starting to change their minds. Their mindsets were starting to shift. And for me, that was really hopeful. And so after that happened, I started engaging a little bit more on social media, reading more about what was happening. I personally was not super familiar with police abolition as an idea before, and so I started doing a lot more reading and listening around that topic. Things have died down a little bit. They're not as energetic and people are not as passionate about it as they were before, but I have seen a lot more people kind of educate themselves, really try to listen to what other people are saying, which I think is very different from last time and does give me hope. I think a lot of systemic changes have not really been happening in a meaningful way, but I'm hoping that that will eventually change, because I mean, systems change takes time. And so unfortunately, we have to be somewhat patient with that, but I do think that this time is different based on the ways that I've seen people respond.
As a Black woman, I think my experience with police brutality as well as racism, systemic racism, has been long before George Floyd's death. I think George Floyd's death has awakened more people because of the exposure of social media. But the experiences of devaluing Black lives for me had gone way before that. And so the experience for me was not another. This can't be happening again to someone who reflects my community. And it had been very tragic and traumatizing for myself and people who look like me to have to experience at the hand of a system that's supposed to protect us to brutally assassinate us continuously. And before George Floyd, there was Breonna Taylor, there was Ahmaud Arbery, there was Philando Castile, and the list goes on. So for me, I think my frustration and my anger has always been that the system that's embedded in white supremacy as the US has never valued Black lives. And so my exposure to this is every day in my community when I see, I think for me, it moved beyond just seeing what happened to George Floyd, because I think that was awakening for many people in the US. Because it was more like, we hear about the violence, we hear about what happened, but as soon as it leaves the media, everything goes back to normal. And for me, that's not my normal. That has never been my normal. Just acknowledging that we're all called to the movement in different ways and honoring where we are. So the ways I've been able to do something in my community is honoring that I'm a healer by nature. That's what I see myself as. So how do I bring people into a space to be able to dialogue about their trauma, dialogue about this experience, and also work through healing while holding our systems of oppression accountable to create change, and acknowledging that the change starts with us. Like, we can't depend on a system of oppression to heal us or free us. It was me taking my power back and saying that I no longer need to make white people comfortable at the expense of my own peace of mind and sanity. And so for me, that was a part of the healing process, but also allowing people to sit in their anger and frustration.
As a progressive Canadian organization, is that there's several layers to this. Like, from my perspective, there's the layer that you work on yourself, like your inner works. So, for example, I know that people my age, millennials, it's become a lot more common to do the inner work for, like, for example, to be a better partner in your relationships. But at the same time, it's also been about doing the inner work in analyzing what are the systems of power at play, and also what are the systems of oppression, and how do they continue to benefit certain groups.
In the US, the issue is a Black and white issue, right? And it's been this way for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? The inception of slavery and Black folks being brought, well, individual from African descent being brought to the US, and being devalued, seen as 3/5 of a person, like all those things, right, has created the America that we see today, that has created all the inequities that we see today, right? And I believe that even though the form of enslavement has changed, the foundation is still the same, right? And so I believe that's the issue, and that's the illness. And I saw it on a CNN, I think it was the topic, it was like, we're facing two diseases, racism and COVID-19, right? And so it's not as blatant as it was back years ago when slavery was still legal. Now it's more so, let's incarcerate Black and brown folks at a higher rate than any other race. Or it's, let us discriminate against someone with buying a house and getting a mortgage loan or redline. It's all of these factors now that we still show you that you're inferior and we're superior, but we don't make it feel like it's so blatant and overt anymore. We're going to find a way to take you down. So I believe like the foundation of this country has been built on white supremacy. It's still being upheld. And even with bringing, I love how people say, Barack Obama was president for 8 years. Racism doesn't exist anymore. That's a lie, right? Like, I love Dr. Tessie Cottman's book, Thick. She has a beautiful quote that's like, the system has to allow there to be exception to the rule for us to believe that there isn't a rule, right? Like, it's no longer the system problem or why I'm in the space I'm in. It's now my problem, right? We had a Black president. That's your issue now, right? It's not a race issue, but we see it day to day, right? When a Black man can be gunned down for standing and trying to break up an intercase, like not just after George Floyd, the brutal killing of George Floyd, right? Then we have Jacob Blake and his life, right? Like, we have all of these things still happening in this moment where you're constantly seeing like, this is a race issue, and it's still to this day. So that will be my answer to that question.
To respond to Elaine, like it kind of seems like that. Like, I mean, I love Obama, and I love Michelle as well. But it kind of seems like that. You know, the post-Obama era is kind of like Obama. He is kind of like a tokenism. When he is not. Like I love, like I said, I love Barack. I love Michelle, but he is not the most progressive president that America has ever had, or even the most progressive presidential candidate. So, you know, I think that's like a really interesting topic to talk about. Like, you know, after the post-Obama era, it was kind of like, have we entered a post-racial society? But the reality is no. Like, there's so many more layers that need to be addressed. You can't just have this like person saying, "Oh, we did it. It's done."
I know amazing Black leaders that are still oppressed in seats of power. And I think I look at this issue of being like, how do you begin to even acknowledge that even when you have someone in a position of power and they are a person who identify as African American or Black or Indigenous or a person of color, do they really have power? Is the question I pose. Like, how far will a system that's embedded in white supremacy allow you before they stop you? And it's repeated in history where I'll let you get to the table, but I'm not going to let you get out the room, right? So it's this notion that you can have the power, and I want the world to believe that we're progressive and we're post-racial, but I will not let you get any farther that can transform us into an actual anti-racist nation.
One of the conflicts that we do have, particularly you know, in British Columbia, my province, is like the notion of resource development projects. And like, we are on unceded territory. That basically means that like in BC, like there haven't been treaties signed for a lot of like the land. So therefore, formally, per the Constitution, the federal government and provincial government need to have like prior informed consent with the Indigenous groups that you know, have been living in that territories for millennia. At the same time, like, you know, to relate back to what you're saying, Elaine, about tokenism and having like that one person, what I'm seeing is that I am seeing that, like, in terms of resource development projects, like there are companies who are and pro resource development organizations who are basically saying, oh well, we got the sign off from this one like indigenous chief or this one indigenous fraction, when like you look at that, like the vast majority of like indigenous peoples, particularly in BC, are opposed to some of like the major pipelines that have been discussed.
I want to directly start with some points that Elaine made to the last question. I think to her point, at least specifically in the US, there aren't very many like legal ways in which discrimination is justified, right? Exactly the opposite, right? It's illegal to discriminate based on race, gender, etc. But that fundamentally has not changed the ways that people think and behave, right? Like in this country, it's still like people think white people are superior to people of other races and ethnicities, and that might not be something that people are willing to own up to or explicitly say, but it's very much a reality in exactly the ways that Elaine has described it. And so I would say, like, kind of similar to what Alison was saying, right? Like, one of the first things that needs to change is individuals' behaviors and mindsets and the ways that they're thinking about these issues, right? And so it is on the onus of individual people to educate themselves, to listen to other people's experiences that they might not be able to identify with, right? Like me as an Asian American who came from an upper middle class background, like there are certain levels of privilege that I have and certain experiences that I will never understand. And so I need to spend a lot of time listening, right? Listening to people like Elaine, listening to others that I will never be able to experience that world. But I do know that like we need to do more work in trying to shift people's mindsets and behaviors. And it's not just on the onus of people of color, right? Like this needs to be something that we all do. I think for way too long, it's been expected that Black people educate everyone, which is just not okay, right? That's not how it's supposed to be. As a society, this is a problem that we have all created and that we all need to address.
And like the way I see young people coming into this movement is acknowledging what are your strengths? What do you have? What is that thing that you have that no one else have? And be able to really allow your light to shine in that space. And so I believe like we all have gifts. Like my gift may not be protesting, or my gifts may not be talking to politicians. My gifts may be healing or doing art or doing something that really helps keep the movement moving forward. And also acknowledging the power that's in your experiences, the power that's in who you are. Like me as a young adult, I am a person who's been gifted to speak truth to power. I come to tables, I see white supremacy showing up, I call it out. I let you sit with discomfort. I let you deal with that. I let you unpack that. But I'm not going to sit at this table and pretend like nothing exists. And I'm okay with walking away acknowledging that in my Blackness, I have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable when everyone else is uncomfortable. Because as we've been taught to survive for many years, I've been taught that if I assimilate to white culture, then I can stay between the lines and I can survive, right? My life won't be taken if I obey what white supremacy has taught me. No more. So I would say young people continue to say no more and stand behind that no more, acknowledging that you don't have to continue to allowing the status quo be the status quo. And I believe that inner work is so important, because just because it's been passed down and taught to you doesn't mean it's right. I believe that the issue is big, but I believe that if we begin to do our inner work, if we begin to say no more and also stand in our truth and our gifts, we can create the change we want to see and also be that.
What do we do like as like youth? Like how do we show allyship while not co-opting their voices? And like how do we basically be the best ways to like shape the societies that we want, which is a more fair, which is a more kinder society, more equal society. And so for me, like I personally also face this from like an individual level. It's more so like I am like a person of color, like I'm like the model minority, right? And like Kathy, you did touch on that. But at the same time, it's like how do we like navigate the system where we are working for people but without speaking for them.
And I would also I would say, yes, young people are the future, but they are very much the present, right? The Black Lives Matter movement was started by young people. Like most major movements and social changes that happen in society are spearheaded by young people. Like Martin Luther King, when he gave his I Had a Dream speech, was like 24 years old. Like a lot of people forget how young a lot of these like big kind of peace builder, like activist people are. Like it's all young people, right? And I think nowadays with social media, young people have so much more power to have their voices be heard. And so I would say, as a young person, like never think that you are not powerful, that you are not able to create significant change, because that's just historically been proven wrong. I think there's a misconception that like oppression is purely beneficial for the oppressor, right? That like oppressive systems, particularly when it comes to white supremacy, like, oh, well, like, you know, white people don't have to worry about that. Oh, like it only benefits them, right? Like that's not the case, right? Like oppressive systems are bad for everyone, right? That's just been shown over and over and over again, right? Like if you have to oppress others in order to have power, that's not real power, right? And you constantly feel like threatened by it because your power isn't true. It's not real, right? It's not legitimate. And so like how do you start to show white people that that's the case, and that the current system they might think works for them, but it really actually doesn't, right? Like white fragility proves that, right? The fact that you just even bring up this concept and people completely shut down, like that makes it very clear that clearly the system doesn't work for them either.
Looking at it from a universal perspective of like, if the most marginalized needs are met and they're able to have equity, everyone has equity. Being that someone who sits at the multi aspects of the table, I'm doing the fight and living the experience. That's exhausting. Like I'm living this every day. I don't get to tap out. I don't get to say, oh, well, I'm not going to turn the news on. I got to endure it. I have to endure this every single day. And so for me, sometimes I have to step away and say that this is not, I've said my piece. I've brought myself to this table to be a healer. I brought myself to this table to be a reconciler, but you don't even see that there's a need of it.
So ultimately, solidarity, being there for the long fight. It's going to be a long fight for racial and ethnic equality and equity. And it's okay to take breaks within these fights. The thing is, like within STAND, we are a volunteer-run organization. Like our organization, like we are known to basically go through like ebbs and flows, because like we'll go through like peaks where we would spend a lot of time working on campaigns, but then also recognizing that when we go through like our like slight valleys, which is like it's more so of like recharging, so that you know we can keep going.
We're in a time where radical imagination is so important. Like just like what is your wildest dreams of a world where liberation and equity is the norm, right? And I would just encourage young people, dream of that world and do whatever it takes to achieve that, right? Like I believe that takes resistance, but also peace building, and as well as coming to that notion of coming to the table, right? Like I appreciate the diversity of experience and diversity of knowledge and just wisdom, and having intergenerational dialogues like we are, and encouraging more dialogues, encouraging more ways of understanding each other, but also in that encouragement, accountability, holding each other accountable to not going back to business as usual, and allowing the status quo be the same narrative we have for centuries to come.
I would also add to Elaine's point about kind of dreaming big and going after that dream. So I think two points, and I think Elaine kind of spoke to this, but you know, finding the right people to help you get there. And I would encourage people not to just look for the usual suspects, right? Like reach across those divides, try to better understand the experiences of other people. And that should lead you to like being open to having your dream change, right? So I was listening to a podcast on police abolition, and the guest is, you know, a big police abolitionist and activist. And the interviewer asked her, so what does the world look like with police abolition? And she says, honestly, I have no idea, because we all need to build that together, right? So I think, you know, definitely having your dream of what you want the world to look like, but being humble enough to acknowledge the fact that you have a very limited perspective and you need other people's perspectives to help you get there and to help you not just realize that dream, but reimagine it. In order to build a better world, right, it has to include everyone. That's exactly how we got into the problems that we're in right now, is by not including people who need to be included in the decision making. Again, I don't have the answers as to like how exactly to do this, because it's hard, right? To be able to take, for example, a Black person and a neo-Nazi, put them in the same room together and be like, look, we need to create a better system that works for everyone. Like, I'm not going to pretend to know exactly how to do that. But I think that's ultimately the only way that we're going to be able to come up with creative solutions that will actually build a better society. And I think that's really where the peace building part comes into play. Because at the end of the day, right, peace building is simply an approach for problem solving. It's a radically inclusive approach for problem solving. And so I think we need to definitely take that lens in terms of figuring out how we can dismantle unjust systems.